Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dominique Gomez, and I am from the Salazar Center at Colorado State University. Thank you so much for joining us today for our conservation conversation. This is a collaboration of now 10 university centers that works to highlight solutions in climate, conservation, and environment. And this is our second to last conversation. We are so glad that you are joining us today. A little bit of quick housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so we will send out a link to the recording to everyone who registered within the next few days. So if you want to share it with your colleagues, or if you have to drop off a little bit early, we will send out that link. All attendees are on mute, but we would love to hear your questions. We will get to as many questions as we possibly can. You can submit them throughout the webinar through the question box on the control panel. And lastly, please register for upcoming webinars as well as view all the past webinars in the series at conservationconversations.org. And with that, Jim Lyons, I want to introduce Jim, who will take it away and talk about today's session.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate everyone joining us today. And thanks, Dominique, for the introduction. I'm Jim Lyons, and I'm actually connecting with you from Hewitt, New Jersey, which is in northern New Jersey. Hewitt is named after the designer of the New York subway system, Abraham Hewitt. But it's the homeland of the Munsee Lenape tribe in New Jersey. Their landscape extended across most of New Jersey, including down into the southern parts of the state. I'll be your moderator for today's conservation conversation. Today's conversation will focus on environmental justice, equity, and inclusion as they impact Native Americans and tribes across the West. There are 567 distinct sovereign Native American nations throughout the United States. In total, Native Americans manage nearly 60 million acres of land, rich in natural and cultural resources, more often in accordance with conservation measures practiced by generations before them. They are managed for those purposes. In spite of their successes, Native Americans continue to struggle to deal with the inequities created mostly by white male conservation leaders and have been subject to these impacts for generations. Most often, this is manifest in the failure of the conservation establishment to include Native Americans in decisions affecting the management of their natural resources, in the treatment of their native lands, in respecting their expertise and traditional ecological knowledge, and in providing them with opportunities to advance their knowledge and secure employment in the conservation field. At a time when attention is focused on equity and inclusion, it is important to discuss why the conservation establishment, largely white and male, continues to fail to adequately engage with Indigenous Americans seeking to manage their native lands and associated landscapes in the ecosystems they have occupied for generations. Our panelists will discuss long-standing practices impacting Indigenous peoples and ways to finally begin to address these challenges as they affect Native Americans, tribal lands, and natural resource conservation. Our panelists today include Dr. Rosalind LaPierre, a member of the Blackfoot tribe of Montana and Métis, who is an award-winning Indigenous writer, ethnobotanist, an environmental activist and associate professor at the University of Montana. She is the only enrolled Blackfoot tribal member to receive tenure at the University of Montana. She's written extensively about Indigenous knowledge and environmental activism in Indigenous communities, including several articles about the Standing Rock protests of the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. She'll be followed by Dr. Robin Saha, an associate professor of environmental and climate change studies at the University of Montana, who is a leading environmental justice scholar and activist. He is co-author of Toxic Wastes and Race in 20, a follow-up to a landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, which helped launch the EJ movement. He is also nationally recognized for using community-based participatory research and collaborating with tribes and rural communities in Montana on environmental and climate justice issues. Finally, Dr. Chad Bishop will join us. Chad is director of the Wildlife Biology Program and associate professor for the Department of Ecosystem and Conservation Sciences at the University of Montana. In addition to his leadership of the university's well-known wildlife biology program, Dr. Bishop also teaches courses and is conducting multiple research projects. Prior to the University of Montana, Chad spent nearly 16 years working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, initially as a researcher and later as an administrator. Each of our panelists will offer a few introductory remarks, and then we'll open up the discussion to entertain questions from our listeners. If you have a question, you should send those to us, and we'll sort through the questions and do our best to address as many as we can. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. LaPierre for her comments.
So thank you very much, Jim and Dominique. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this series, the Conservation Conversations, and the opportunity to participate in today's panel. So just this last week, I was in Missouri, in St. Louis, not far from Ferguson, where Michael Brown was murdered by police and where the Black Lives Matter movement and resistance emerged. It is also a place where, as Harvard historian Walter Johnson has written in The Broken Heart of America, that racial injustice, violence, American imperialism, and capitalism intersect together to form the central story of American history. If you have not read that book, it's a great book. And just this past weekend, I spent the day on the Standing Rock Reservation and along the Missouri River in the Dakotas, where the No DAPL, or the No Dakota Access Pipeline, protests and the Water is Life movement began. This, as many people know, brought awareness to Indigenous environmental injustices, and it also brought awareness to contemporary police violence towards peaceful protesters. Both of these places and their stories of racism, white supremacy, capitalism, and state-sponsored violence are interconnected and necessary to tell ourselves and remind ourselves of. It is because of these events and the more recent murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police this past spring that the conservation establishment began to reflect back on their own history of racism and state-sponsored violence. This past summer, the Sierra Club challenged their own history of leadership that was held by proponents of eugenics and white supremacy, of their erasure of Indigenous histories and peoples from the landscape, of their complicity in perpetuating their own mythology as white saviors of the natural world. So for many of us within the Indigenous environmental activism circles, their public confession was a long time coming. So in today's panel, I'm hoping to stress 2 points, which have been addressed by other scholars and other activists, and to also ask a few questions about what the future holds for us. So first off, I think we need to address America's history of racism, white supremacy, capitalism, and state-sponsored violence. As environmental scholar Jedediah Purdy wrote about in his well-regarded New Yorker essay, Environmentalism's Racist History. Understanding these foundational quote-unquote values of American life are central to our understanding the conservation and preservation movements of the 19th and 20th centuries and the environmental movement of the late 20th century. And second, I think we need to address the idea of wilderness as both a myth and a construct. As environmental historian Bill Cronin wrote about 25 years ago in his New York Times essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, where he stated that, quote, the removal of Indians to create uninhabited wilderness reminds us just how invented and how constructed the American wilderness really is, unquote. So that brings us to the future. So as an environmental historian, I actually believe the cliche, to understand the present, you have to understand the past. Jedediah Purdy states that understanding environmentalism's racist past, quote, is part of an explanation, but not an excuse, unquote. So as we move forward, how do we move past explanations and excuses? How will mainstream conservation institutions address racism, white supremacy, capitalism, and state-sponsored violence, both historically and in their contemporary reiterations? How will they address the deep-seated myth they continue to perpetuate of America as an empty landscape, erasing Indigenous peoples. I believe it is especially important to remind Americans that wherever they go, they are standing on Indigenous lands, lands that were often violently taken from Indigenous peoples as part of American imperialism and capitalism. And in the case of public lands, removed in an effort to recreate an empty landscape, quote unquote, untrammeled by man. The Sierra Club stated that they will, quote, try to repair the harm they've caused, unquote. What will this entail? Will they work to return lands taken from Indigenous peoples and uphold treaty rights? Will they erase the myth of the wilderness and instead push forward the true story of America as a peopled landscape? So these are some of the questions that I'm interested in addressing today. And thank you again for the opportunity to participate in today's panel.
Thank you, Rosalind. Let's go to Dr. Sahan.
Greetings, folks. I am here in Missoula, Montana, and I'm also really grateful for the invitation and to the organizers for facilitating this conference, this webinar. I'm going to read our place acknowledgement here at the University of Montana. We acknowledge that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor the path they have always shown us in caring for this place for generations to come. I go by the pronouns he, him, his, and I am a person of color. I am biracial, the son of an immigrant from South Asia, and I'm also of Eastern European heritage. On the tribal environmental justice issues that I work on, such as the restoration of the National Bison Range to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, I've learned to navigate my role as a non-Indigenous person who works to support tribal interests. For me, it's a way of working to correct centuries of injustice. Sadly, much of this work involves working in opposition to conservation organizations, also anti-Indian organizations, and in some cases, it's actually hard to tell the difference between the two, at least in effect, on tribal efforts to preserve their culture, to restore their connections to culturally significant places, and the physical and natural features they're in. In the case of the National Bison Range, an 18,000-acre U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service unit that lies entirely within the Flathead Indian Reservation, I'm pleased to report that the conservation community in Montana has come to support the tribe's efforts to regain the land and to continue to manage it for wildlife conservation and public access. This includes both statewide and national conservation groups. There are other examples as well, such as the case of the Badger II Medicine area in Lewis and Clark National Forest, adjoining Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness, an area that the Blackfeet tribe objected to having as a wilderness area, designated wilderness area, and an area of great cultural significance to the Blackfeet tribe. There are also examples of productive engagement that is not occurring, even though it has the potential to enhance natural resource protection, as well as further tribal interests and advance Indigenous rights. The positive examples have not come about entirely by chance, but rather through a growing recognition of environmental injustice against tribes, a sense of an ethical duty and responsibility to understand the historical and present day injustices and to work with tribes towards addressing them. However, the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the conservation movement is a huge obstacle to such work. This problem has been recognized for at least 30 years, but nevertheless persists. And I will show some slides here that, in just a second, that demonstrate this, this issue. All right, are you seeing my screen, hopefully?
Looks great.
So in 1990, a group of environmental justice advocates, activists, called out the environmental movement for its lack of diversity and for not understanding and working on people of color issues. This was quite a shot across the bow, and after that, there were studies and reports such as the Inside the Environmental Movement by Don Snow in '92, and also Beyond the Green, a study by the Environmental Careers Organization that showed that the conservation movement was predominantly white and white male led. After that, there were a number of different studies that showed that, in fact, this one, Green of Another Color, that only 0.2% of foundation funds were going towards people of color organizations in the environmental movement. And since then, a number of other studies and reports have tried to assess the current state of diversity within the movement. Two ones in particular that I want to highlight were developed by Dorceta Taylor, and she was one of my faculty at the University of Michigan, and she's now at Yale. In this first report from 2014, she surveyed 191 environmental organizations, 71 government agencies, and 28 leading grant-making foundations, and investigated their gender and racial diversity, which most of them said they highly value. The report found that whites comprise more than 80% of the board members of these groups, 85% of the staff, 62% of the board positions. I apologize, I meant her 2018 report of 2,000 organizations. And the summary of the key findings were that groups are beginning to engage in diversity, equity, inclusion activities, that we're seeing some movement towards greater gender diversity. The other report refers to the green ceiling, this idea that groups, even though they are diversifying, have not broken really the 16% or 12 to 16% green ceiling, despite people of color making up 36% of the population and 29% of those in the science and engineering workforce. They documented in the study unconscious bias, discrimination, insular recruiting as a factor in this issue, and lackluster effort and disinterest in addressing diversity, and refer to the Green Insiders Club. We see that the representation of people of color in environmental organizations lagging far behind those of the population, and this is across the boards within NGOs, within government agencies, and in foundations. In order to move forward, leaders of these groups and others have identified a number of factors, including adequate and stable funding for groups that work on this interface, committed leadership, organizational buy-in, and a bit greater ability to work and communicate across race, gender, class lines. So in doing this work, it's just been recognized that there's a huge problem of institutional discrimination within the conservation movement, and that requires then addressing or institutionalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a tremendous challenge, and it requires tracking, it requires accountability, it requires resources and transparency. And we've seen so many different injustices facing Native Americans that Professor Lapierre referred to. These are areas where we need to right the ship, where conservation groups need to work to address these historical and present day environmental injustices. And we do it, I think, this is my sort of justification, I think, but we should all be thinking about why do this work. And ethically, it's the right thing to do. It's working to right historic wrongs. It's supporting Indigenous rights. It's building capacity to manage effectively those 60 million acres, but also giving Indigenous peoples more opportunities to have an influence in off-reservation rights, their treaty rights, to exercise those treaty rights. And it also is furthering mission accomplishment by building and strengthening cross-cultural alliances within the conservation community. And so today, other topics that I think are important to further this work include expanding the notions and narratives of what conservation means, of dispelling the human-nature dichotomy, thinking about diversity in terms of culture and connections to place, of working landscapes being part of the conservation agenda, of communities being part of, and it's particularly Indigenous communities being part of the conservation agenda. And then thinking through to what policy tools we have already to further foster collaboration and coordination and co-management and coexistence among and between the federal government and tribes, and taking a hard look at the government-to-government relationship. I look forward to continuing to talk about these topics as we move forward, and thank you so much.
Now we'll go to Chad Bishop from the University of Montana to talk a little bit about the challenges in the graduate program for Native Americans. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you, Jim. I too want to express my thanks to Jim and Dominique for organizing this, providing us the opportunity, to my colleagues, Rosalind and Robin. I'm a white male and I come to this from a great place of humility. I am learning. I've learned a lot in the last 5 years of my time at University of Montana, but I have a lot to learn. I'm learning every day. And so I think it's just important for me to clarify up front. And not only am I not an Indigenous scholar, every day I learn just how much I don't know. Building on what Rosalind and Robin just shared, in particular, some of those statistics about underrepresentation and environmental positions at all levels within our society, that underrepresentation of people of color and Native Americans in general, that then shouldn't surprise any of us that Native American students are underrepresented in our wildlife and natural resource programs at colleges and universities. And maybe that's where my story begins here, is coming to Missoula and building relationships with my Native American colleagues on campus and down the road at Salish Kootenai College and in Western Montana in general, and starting just to learn about this. You know, of course, our tribal partners are well aware of that underrepresentation. And if I go back several years, some of the early conversations before I had learned, I didn't put my heart and soul into that. And I will be the first to admit that I would put up barriers, as we talked about. How might we increase representation with our degree programs? But also over that time, and I learned more, we started finding ways to create pathways, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit. Institutionally and in our natural resource professions in the country, as Robin alluded to, we're also starting to recognize just the importance of this diversity crisis and the need to make change. I can talk a little bit more about that, but I want to really focus right now on this representation in our degree programs. One of my dear friends and colleagues, I'm going to show my screen here for a second. Let's see. Dominique, can you confirm I'm showing the right image there?
Looks great, Matt.
Okay, thank you. So this is just an article that, again, my friend and colleague, Sarah Hoagland, she is a prominent national leader in this nation relative to wildlife and natural resources, one of only several women with a PhD in forestry, Indigenous women. And she's clearly a leader for increasing access for students to, Indigenous students to higher education degree programs in wildlife and natural resources. But just for all of us to get a little perspective here, this is a graphic that she took from a broader report that was published in 2013. The next one will come out in 2023. But it just shows you, these are the total numbers across non-tribal college institutions of numbers of students enrolled in these degree programs that you can see here. I mean, we're talking dozens. If we look at how many graduate in a year, it can be in the order of 10 to 15. I think that we need to think about those statistics, and those of us working in fish and wildlife programs at universities need to really take that to heart, in my view. Why, I think, do we look at this? Why is this happening? One thing that I think we do see progress on is our doors are opening to undergraduate education opportunities. But what's really key is that many jobs require master's degrees in wildlife and closely related disciplines. Or at the very least, those with master's degrees are going to have more opportunities in competing for jobs and be more successful generally. And yet that's where the doors are really closed. So few Native American students have had any opportunities into that. And some of the work that my colleagues and I with partnerships across the tribal community are trying to just open some of those doors into graduate education. So what have some of the barriers been? Well, one is our Western culture and the way we've approached admissions into graduate school. We've often posted graduate project opportunities on national job boards. We might get over 100 applicants for one funded graduate position. We then use things like GRE scores to quickly and easily reduce that down to maybe 10 or 20 students that we might, or prospective applicants that we might then further consider. That very act alone just ignores so many things, but it shuts down those doors. It shuts the doors. One thing we've come to learn as our faculty and colleagues here at University of Montana, and my colleagues rather in the wildlife biology program, is that we've studied the role of GRE scores now. We've understood those cultural biases that exist and the need to think differently. We're looking at, we're changing our admissions procedures and looking at holistic review processes as others in the country have done. We worked closely with just a few folks, but Janine Lichtenberg at Salish Kootenai College, and I mentioned Sarah Hoagland already, a national leader. Jen Harrington, just here at University of Montana, heading our natural resources program for Native American students. And I want to give credit to Pat Zollner at Purdue, who's helped me grow and our faculty grow, and as we look at opportunities here to support more Native American students, especially in graduate programs. And so we've been doing that. We've admitted 7 new students just in the past couple falls into our wildlife program, and additional ones into other natural resource programs here. But I wouldn't say that this is something we're far down this path yet. We're making headway, and we're trying to make positive change to do our part in helping address this underrepresentation. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jim.
Very good, Chad. Thank you very much, and thanks to all the panelists. So I've got a number of questions that have come in, and I want to answer as many as we can, as quickly as we can. So Chad, just one that just came in. So you've talked about some of the challenges and what you've observed in your career. The question is, do you think that other institutions and your peers in the wildlife community, they see the same challenges as well as the value in trying to encourage and include Native Americans in graduate programs in wildlife and conservation?
So I certainly know firsthand that that absolutely some do, and I think here's kind of where I might respond to that. Is I was president recently, now past president of what's called the National Association of University Fisheries and Wildlife Programs. It's comprised of the department heads of fish and wildlife programs across the country, and this has been probably the major issue before us in the last year or two in terms of how do we start to collectively make a bigger difference. So I don't want to take too much time on it, but I've learned a lot from some of my colleagues there and applied that here, and I know the reverse is happening. We've had one of our members who's the dean at Vermont. They're even exploring incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into their faculty evaluation process. That's a pretty out of the, well, that would be out of the norm for how we evaluate faculty typically. So it just shows you some of the dialogue that's happening. But we all have a long ways to go, and I think every one of my peers in the country at the university department head level would say that. Great.
So Rosalind, I've got a question for you. You touched on and referred to the wilderness myth, and an interesting question, but I would admit that I spent a lot of time when I worked in the Congress writing wilderness legislation, and was successful in getting a lot of it passed, including some of the Montana bills. And the issues associated with Native Americans were seldom discussed. So what do you think tribes need to do? What do the advocates for wilderness need to do to better address the concerns of the tribes that are impacted? And there are certainly more proposals pending. There are proposals pending in Montana as an example. How should they go about working with Native Americans to ensure that their concerns are part of the discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that as I mentioned in my opening, I think one of the major issues that we have in America is just the myth of a kind of an empty landscape, a myth of wilderness, you know, the myth of the Garden of Eden. And that started from the moment that Europeans stepped foot here, right? And so this is something that is very deeply ingrained in our American culture. And so it's not going to be something easily unpacked, but I think that it's something that conservation leaders can take that leadership role to start unpacking that. And one of the things they can do is stop using the word wilderness. And I think that if they start redefining the landscape as a peopled landscape versus the empty, untrammeled by man definition. So one way is, you know, to redefine what we even have in the Wilderness Act to describe what is quote unquote, right, what we define as wilderness, which has never existed. It really is a myth. And so I think that leadership needs to come from the conservation community, and it's something that we need to rewrite those pieces of legislation at the very beginning, and we need to start reteaching our own students that is a myth, and that because one of the things that I see as a problem, a bad byproduct of that is that then when we try to do science, right, when we try to do things like, you know, restoration ecology, when we're trying to even study, like I live right next to Glacier National Park, when we're doing research in these places, we have this baseline idea, this baseline definition of the natural world as a place that's devoid of humans. And that has not been the case here, at least for 33,000 years in North America, right? So until we change that definition, until science and scientists kind of redefine that baseline as including Indigenous people, that myth is going to continue. But I think that leadership has got to come from the conservation community, change that language, change those words, and really just redefine what North America was and is. So thank you for that question.
No, very good. So Robin, I have one for you. You have a lot of experience in working with tribes on these issues as a consultant and in guiding them in the decisions that they need to make in the context of these issues. So the question is, do you have any experience or examples you can point to of successful efforts where Indigenous rights, values, and our knowledge has been appropriately incorporated in environmental analysis and decision making?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll refer or expand on the example of the National Bison Range. I see a great, a great level of support and understanding coming from the conservation community, but also from the federal government in appreciating the fact that that unit was essentially a taking. The federal courts ruled it was a taking. The tribes were not happy with that carving out of its reservation. So the positive things I think come from working together to advance Indigenous rights in ways that really help. We haven't seen that come to fruition yet, but I'm optimistic that it will. And I think it definitely takes a village. It takes a lot of support from all levels of government to bring back to essentially, in this case, repatriate lands that were taken from the tribes. And this is been seen as a sort of a slippery slope or but it is a special case and a very important one that we need to support.
Very good. So another question, maybe this is an obvious one since there's so much focus on the issue right now, but in the context of climate change, the questioner points to the fact that there's a great deal of knowledge that Native Americans can bring to the table in terms of dealing with changing climates, a knowledge that goes back generations. What are the ways to better engage Native Americans and tribes in helping land managers, federal land managers, and even private landowners and managers in better adapting to and dealing with the challenge of climate change based on their experience in managing their own landscapes? And I don't know if Rosalind or Robin, whoever wants to address that, or Chad.
I can start out. I think there's a lot of sort of converging points here, to pick up on Rosalind's point about the myth of wilderness too, certainly recognizing the role tribes have played in fire management. All the problems that we're in right now with fires, are certainly exacerbated by climate change, but they, in many ways, were created by removing the presence of Indigenous fire management techniques from the landscape. So, there's that has potential, but for tribes working on climate change, they're experiencing on their landscapes, on their reservations, serious effects right now, and including losses of traditional plants and animals or migration of them, and so that are integrally tied to their cultural identities. So those are things we've seen here. I've seen in working with some tribes in Montana. And at the same time, I think it's really largely a capacity issue that ties into a lot of what Brad was talking about, bringing in, increasing the capacity of tribes to manage their own resources. And it's important to recognize that many tribes do hire tribal members, but outside people outside the community too, and they've been increasing their capacity to manage their natural resources in significant ways. Conservation groups like the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, the Wilderness Society have been working with tribes on climate change issues, providing connections to government resources, providing technical assistance, to supporting relations with communities nearby. So there's a lot of good work going on in this area right now.
Very good. Rosalind, do you have any thoughts on that in particular? Actually, I know you do. So.
Well, I mean, I think this is a really large topic, and it's something that obviously Indigenous people have been thinking about this and working on this for many years, and it's something that people from outside of Indigenous communities have only recently begun to think about and began to recognize and have some respect for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing. Within Indigenous communities, obviously, it's something that Indigenous people know about and have been passing on for generations. But I think that one of the things that the conservation leaders can do in this regard is to begin to, again, erase the myth of the wilderness, but also to have real genuine relationships with the tribes that fall within the areas where they do work, and to have genuine relationships with Indigenous environmental leaders. And also, as Chad has mentioned earlier, you know, one of the things I think that conservation groups can be doing is, you know, put the money where their mouth is, which is some of these large conservation groups should be funding, and I would argue fully funding, you know, Indigenous students to get through their graduate program, get through their PhD. This is something that is very difficult for, you know, all students to find funding to, you know, go to graduate school, but it's especially difficult for Indigenous students. And this is something that conservation leaders can easily do, is take some of their funding that they get and provide it for students, so that there is the pipeline from Indigenous communities where traditional knowledge is already being shared and passed on to those young people, that then they can go and get a Western science education to then go back to their communities to work with both conservation groups and within their own tribal communities. So I think there's great opportunity that exists here within this realm of promoting Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing within the conservation community. So.
Very good. So Chad, an interesting question from a student from an institution I know, who points to the fact that, to, I believe it's his knowledge, there's only one student of Native American descent currently enrolled in the graduate program that he's involved in. And so Rosalind brought up this question about providing private funding to help support students from the Native American community. I mean, is that something the committee you've been involved in has discussed? Is that something that needs to be elevated, a discussion to be had with leaders of major universities, et cetera? Clearly, the BIPOC has been impacted in many ways, and there seem to be efforts on the part of some schools to respond, at least to try to address some of the racial inequities and cultural inequities that have existed. But the Native American issue seems to be lagging behind to some degree. That's my observation. So what do you think is possible? What would you recommend if you had a chance to talk to the university presidents with regard to this particular issue?
So just I'll respond there in two parts. And I think the first part is, we still, as university academic programs and wildlife and no doubt natural resources and STEM, probably more broadly, still need to go through full, we have our own change and adaptation processes to go through, and we're doing that. So first you have to look at those admission standards, and how are we looking at this? How do we really value diversity? Have we really gone through, this is what I've gone through, I'll just say personally, a growth process is what I would call it, in terms of really thinking through our admission standards and the biases associated with them. Then, when you've worked through some of that, then I think the funding comes in huge. Because now all of a sudden, yes, funding is always so key in our field, where we basically almost all of our grad students are doing thesis projects. It's very typical that we support them with stipends, that we cover the tuition, we fund that research. And so yeah, there are funding programs out there. I've learned that it's key that our Native students have those resources on campus, which we do here to help fully leverage those resources. And we're a Sloan institution as well at University of Montana, which is another support system out there for Indigenous students pursuing graduate school in STEM. But to still fund the research, Rosalind was exactly right. And one of the key things I can just report here is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was instrumental in allowing us to admit 3 students this fall to University of Montana by supporting them. So it was just to Rosalind's point, that's transformational. Those students would not be here right now if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hadn't stepped up.
Very good. It's very helpful. So we have an election coming up, and it's a time that everyone kind of looks at federal government and federal programs. I've been through 2 transitions, worked for 2 different presidents in that regard. Given the renewed focus on these issues, is it time to look at government institutions? And the most obvious one is the Bureau of Indian Affairs or other institutions to enhance or encourage their interest in and commitment to try to bring Indigenous people, Native Americans into programs and provide additional support and assistance? Is that one conduit that maybe is worth pursuing in the near term, whether it's in a new Trump administration or under a Biden administration?
I mean, yes, I would just say in regards to that, well, one, I would say not just the Department of Interior, which is the Bureau of Indian Affairs is under the Department of Interior, but most of our lands, our public lands, fall under different agencies and have different jurisdictions. And I think that all of those agencies that on the federal level that manage our public lands, I think they do need to have some sort of, again, as we just mentioned, kind of a pipeline of native people going from their community to the university to getting a job in those places. We are not going to have that leadership in those places by Indigenous people until we kind of have that pipeline going. And again, it's different agencies. You guys know what all of these agencies are, but the different agencies that manage public lands. I mean, it's not just the Department of Interior, but others as well. I think that one of the things that happens, especially when we talk about Indigenous people or Indigenous lands, we always just talk about Department of Interior. But I think that there's always an opportunity with any change in administration to try to impact change, because as you know, it's usually during that transition time where you can try and make hopefully a positive change in your direction during the transition for people getting hired in leadership positions, but also the policies that you want to push forward start moving along during that transition time. So I'm always optimistic. So,
well, I think we all want to be optimistic. I mean, I brought up the BIA, but to your point, Rosalind, we have the Forest Service, we have the Park Service, we have the Bureau of Land Management, we have other agencies that are involved in public lands, and at least from my experience, some efforts have been made to try to enhance opportunities for minorities, for Native Americans, et cetera. What I hear you saying is that maybe a significant push to help all those agencies recognize the void that exists in bringing Native Americans into managing lands that probably the ancestors knew better than the managers do today might be a worthwhile thing to pursue. Would you agree, or Robin?
Yeah, can I add? I agree 100%. I think what's so important is to not just have capacity for tribes to manage their own resources, but because there's such a strong interest in among tribes in the management of federal lands, traditional lands, and resources of cultural significance, that diversification of the federal agencies is really important. We especially when it comes to tribal consultation, if you will, or strengthening the government-to-government relationship between the federal government and tribes, which is frankly broken to a large degree, that there's so much distrust and ineffectiveness in that process that to really move forward with that, we're going to need to have better relations that I think take a lot of understanding. And also I'll add that the Tribal Self-Governance Act of 1994 is probably one of the most underutilized tools for providing, it's a policy tool essentially for enabling tribes to co-manage federal lands that have historical, cultural, and geographic significance. And that's the tool that's been used for the tribes to be involved in the management of the National Bison Range to date. And the Park Service has not utilized it nearly as much as the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's some great opportunity to really, co-manage is a little different than collaborate, but to explore those opportunities as well.
So one of the questioners asked along these lines whether or not there are other examples that go beyond, as the questioner refers to, tribal consultation, which is required under NEPA, that go beyond that to promote partnerships or shared stewardship opportunities, et cetera. I don't know, can you point to other examples, or Rosalind, from your experience, have you seen any specific examples that maybe work in that regard?
I was going to say, it looked like Robin was just about to say something, so
I'm sorry.
Well, just the one that I know of that's been touted as pretty effective is Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, where there's been a co-management agreement there for a number of years. So I don't know, Rosalind, go ahead. That's just the one I was going to mention.
okay. Well, I was going to say there are different examples both here in the United States and also internationally. One of the things I would argue is that there's some really great examples internationally in Canada and in some other places around the world where Indigenous communities are working with local governments to manage historic territories of those communities that are no longer now under their management, right? So whether it's federal lands, state lands, et cetera. So some fall under kind of the rubric of what we would consider a national park. Some kind of fall under what we'd consider like conservation lands. In addition to working with federal governments or local governments, there are also some good examples too of some NGOs beginning to work with tribal communities to share management of conservation lands. So for example, and this happened years and years ago, for example, on the Blackfeet Reservation, the Nature Conservancy was able to purchase some land that was an estate sale, and they were able to purchase that land and then return that land to the Blackfeet tribe for tribal management. It's still conservation lands, but the Nature Conservancy was able to work with the tribe to kind of return that land to the tribe. But there's other examples like that where, whether it's kind of a conservation group doing it, working with Indigenous communities, or kind of federal and local governments that address those things, both here in the US and kind of around the world.
So if I could ask you one other question that came in, I'll just read the question. Very curious of Dr. LaPierre's thoughts about the Latinx community with regard to this discussion. They have Indigenous roots and some knowledge that carried in their experience. So why, according to this questioner, why does everyone seem to neglect this heritage?
No, that's a great question. I think that that's something that within Indigenous communities is not neglected, because a lot of Indigenous communities recognize, whether you're a federally recognized tribe or not, in the United States, Canada, but if you look at all of basically North America, Central and South America, those are all Indigenous people that live in those places. And it's something that Indigenous people recognize, but not often non-Indigenous people don't recognize that no matter where you are from the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, you are indigenous to this land and landscape. Even if you're now called Latinx, you're still indigenous. So, I mean, I think that's something that, again, from the outside community, they don't see it. From the inside community, we definitely see it. And there are some great, just for example, there's a lot of great organizations that work in collaboration with each other that recognize kind of the longstanding history of indigenous peoples across the Americas.
Okay, very good. So we have time for one more question, I think. And Chad, I'm going to throw this one to you because it's interesting. And it's interesting in that I think this gets at the heart of our profession. And that is, the question is, what about the word conservation itself? How is that word itself a barrier to equity and inclusion? Isn't it a term embedded in whiteness and wilderness, to the points that have been made earlier? If conservation organizations want to broaden their reach, don't they need to use a different or more inclusive word to describe their interests and their values?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question, and I think it makes a great point. Even the term conservation, which I hadn't thought about yet, to be very honest. And one of the things I haven't mentioned that that I've learned some about here, and we have a long ways to go on this, I think, as a faculty in general. But it's inclusive pedagogy. And one of the things I did when I first arrived here, I mean, I've taught our introductory class to wildlife, and part of the first third of the class is the history of wildlife in North America. You can imagine perhaps the lens that I taught that through, which is what I knew and had learned. I can only imagine, if I think back to my first classes here teaching that for the American Indians in the classroom, looking back at me, probably thought, I mean, they're not in a position to be able to probably readily have fair dialogue in a 100-person class like that. But that's the whole notion of inclusive pedagogy, I think, and then yet it takes courage. So I went for another year here with recognizing the issue, but scared to death to do much different. And then through some Indigenous mentoring programs here, you start learning, well, here's a ways you can do that safely for yourself. And as long as you're coming from a good place and your heart's in the right place, then there'll be understanding within the class for when you trip. And I think that's where, before we can get more Native American faculty in our program, I think that's the place some of us have to try and come from. And I think this question just gets to the heart of that.
Very good. So I just have a minute left. So Robin or Rosalind, do you have final thoughts on that or related issues?
I would say absolutely. The terminology has got to change. And I think that some organizations are at that point, hopefully. So for example, the Sierra Club has mentioned that they're putting $5 million into kind of their, diversity, inclusion, and equity programming. But I think that as part of that, they really need to change the language of the institutions. Once that language changes, then people will feel included into that community. It is very difficult when some of that language is very exclusionary, and the way that people define, again, the land and landscape on which we live on.
Very good.
If I could add
10 seconds, Robin. What do you have?
Yeah, sure. I think the way environmental justice contributes to this discussion is by suggesting that we expand conservation to include community and people and culture, and that we think of the conservation narrative in more of a sociological sense, that we're also conserving knowledge, people, cultures, communities, and their connections to the land too, and not just the resources themselves.
Great point. Great point. Well, great conversation. I want to thank the panelists for their remarks and great contribution. Many challenges that lie ahead, but hopefully this is an important starting point moving forward. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to turn things back to Dominique to wrap things up. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I think all of our attendees learned so much. Before we end today, I just want to plug our final conservation conversation. Perhaps a different word is needed, as we've discussed. We will be discussing next Wednesday at 1 hour later, 1 o'clock Mountain Time, talking about outdoor recreation, challenges and solutions to keeping parks and public lands from being loved to death. This will be led by Utah State University and the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism. With that, thank you all for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon.